Actually, did another video of Boris Johnson.
Women are more likely than men to view Boris Johnson as dishonest. Most recently, a Delta poll survey shows 43% of women think it's a bad thing he's become Prime Minister. And when given a choice of 12 words to describe their feelings, 6 positive and 6 negative, 1 in 3 women picked terrified.
What do you think of Boris Johnson? Does he like a pot on air? Oh, what's the swear word I can say that you can air? Do you think Boris Johnson's a feminist? No. Why? Because he's just never portrayed anything that way. I think he's a straight talker, shoot from the hip, and we've had enough of pussyfooting round Boris all the way.
I don't think it's a case of being a feminist or not being a feminist. I just think across a whole broad of sort of ethics, he just doesn't really have a relationship particularly to people.
I don't think he likes women at all.
So what accounts for this uneasiness among female voters?
We do know that levels of trust appear, at least at the moment, to be higher among men than they are among women. Now, that may, of course, change, but if I was to speculate, I would say that that may well be linked to issues around the number of children that he has, and indeed the nature of his personal relationships. In the past, it has been shown that women are more distrusting of people in such circumstances than men.
Boris Johnson is a self-described feminist.
A feminist is somebody who believes fundamentally in the equality of human beings and the equality of the sexes. That's what I believe.
As Foreign Secretary, he pledged £212 million of UK aid money towards schooling for girls.
Educate girls and you help to solve the problems of the world.
But what does his voting record say? When it comes to women having autonomy over their bodies, Boris Johnson has always abstained on abortion legislation, so we don't actually know his position. He has, however, voted against removing the tampon tax with the VAT charge on sanitary products. Then there's the history of controversial columns. In the 2005 election, he declared, voting...
TV's turned itself off again, guys. I do apologise, but I'm going to turn it back on again. This is what happens sometimes when you're trying to film something. It just wants to turn itself off. There you go.
Tory will cause your wife to have bigger breasts. He's called women at a Labour Party conference hot totty and claimed they were backing Labour because of the fickleness of their sex. In an article marking his exit as Spectator editor, his advice to his successor about their female publisher was, just pat her on the bottom and send her on her way. More recently, of course, he's described women who choose to wear a niqab as letterboxes and bank robbers. All this may well have added to his lack of popularity among women. Meanwhile, opposition leaders Jeremy Corbyn and Jo Swinson don't seem to have the same issue.
Back when David Cameron was Prime Minister, it was often said that he had a problem with women and that his whole flashman mentality was not resonating well with them. So it's certainly something they'll be aware of. In terms of what they're doing with it, well, focusing on things like the NHS, which we've seen recently, historically plays well with women.
So what can Boris Johnson do now to change the way he's perceived?
Well, with me now, the chair of Conservative Friends of Afghanistan, Shabnam Nasimi, the Labour Party parliamentary candidate and director of class think tank Pfizer Shaheen is in Birmingham, and from Kent, the Conservative peer, Baroness Patient Wheatcroft. Welcome to you all, ladies. If we can start with you first of all, Shabnam Nasimi. He says he's a feminist. How has Boris Johnson actually behaved as a feminist?
Well, first of all, the fundamental principle of feminism and conservatism is the belief in equality of opportunity, and the party has worked for over centuries on this matter with the introduction of the 1980 representation of
Yes, but what's Boris Johnson done?
Well, Boris Johnson, his track record really speaks for itself. As Mayor of London, City Hall, the top team, 50% of it comprised of women. As Foreign Secretary, he advocated and campaigned for 12 years of quality education for girls all over the world. And with the diverse cabinet that we see today, his actions prove that he is a feminist and he will continuously advocate for women's rights.
Okay, Pfizer Shaheen, you're a Labour politician, so I don't expect you to express love for Boris Johnson. But are you suggesting that women have serious cause for concern because he's in number 10? Well, I think that report just there spoke at length at all of the different things that Boris Johnson has said. And let's remember that in his new hard right cabinet, he's appointed Jacob Rees-Mogg. Now, Jacob Rees-Mogg believes that even women that have been raped don't have the right to abortion. So, I think a lot of women out there have looked at the history of what Boris Johnson has said and what he's done and who he's picked to be in his cabinet, and quite rightly said, actually, this is a man that isn't a friend of women. But look, it's much wider than that. When you look at polls over the last few days, Boris Johnson's government is incredibly unpopular. 75% of people are already fed up and don't think that he's doing a good job. So look, this is a much bigger issue here. Yes, women are right to question whether he's a feminist and what he's going to do for women, but there's a broader issue about the way in which this country feels towards him.
Baroness Wheatcroft, how do you feel when you hear these polls about a Conservative Prime Minister?
I think it's very difficult not to agree with them. I'm afraid that in Boris Johnson we have somebody who would have sold his grandmother and much more to become Prime Minister, and he's got what he wants. But I don't know that anybody's terribly clear about what he wants to do with that, other than take us out of the European Union on October the 31st, which I believe is a disastrous thing to do.
Okay. Shabnam Nassimi, what do you think about what they've just said and the fact that 1 in 3 women use the word terrified to describe the way they felt about him being in number 10?
Well, let's focus on what the Conservative Party has achieved when it comes to gender equality. The Conservative Party have elected 2 prime ministers in Parliament as leaders. The Conservative Party were the first party to give women the right to vote.
But you keep talking about the party. Let's talk about the man himself.
Boris Johnson's the leader of the Conservative Party. Like myself and many other Conservative activists, we advocate for gender equality, for women's rights, and like myself and other members of Parliament and activists that are female, we will continuously ensure that the party stays in support of equal pay, of ensuring that we have a childcare system for women, ensuring that we end period poverty. And he has campaigned very openly, together with many activists, significant activists, on ending FGM in the UK and supporting them with the global challenge as well. So let's talk about the track record. What has he been able to achieve, what the Conservative Party has been able to achieve, and less on what comments have been made and what may have been taken out of context.
Faiza Shaheen, it's about policy, it's not about comments. These are just jokes, aren't they?
I mean, if you want to talk about the Conservative Party's record on women, just look at austerity, the public sector spending cuts, which Boris Johnson voted for, which have disproportionately hit women. So 83% of the cuts have fallen on the shoulders of women. And when you look at who's been most affected, it's women of colour. So yes, let's look at the Conservative Party record. Let's look at Boris Johnson's record. And again, and we see that he is not delivering for women. Now, when we think about what's going to happen now, with potentially a no-deal Brexit, this terrifying idea that Boris Johnson may even undemocratically squat and hold us captive in government and not stand down even if there is a vote of no confidence. Now, where does that leave all types of policies in this country?
Well, Faiza, it's worth pointing out the Labour Party have never had a female leader, so you've not got a great track record yourselves.
Well, look, I think that's a point about leadership and representation that is a fair point to make. But when you have women that aren't thinking about feminist issues, that aren't delivering for women, then what's the point? So I said this about, for instance, that yes, we have Priti Patel as Home Secretary, for instance, but is it progress to have brown people supporting other brown people? The point of representation is to have those voices there so that groups that are often ignored in policy do get voice in those rooms when decisions are made. And unfortunately, we haven't seen that with even Margaret Thatcher. We saw that with Theresa May, because you can see that in austerity policy, which has disproportionately affected women.
Baroness Wheatcroft, the idea that NHS investment is a strategy to woo female voters, do you think something like that would work?
I think women are essentially sensible in the decisions that they take when they vote. Just saying that one is a feminist and then voting the way that your introduction said Boris Johnson had voted in important matters for women indicates that he's simply saying what he wants people to hear. I would love to see more money going into the NHS if this country can afford it and if it's well spent. I think what we're getting at the moment is a lot of money that's already being pledged being pledged again, and promises made in advance of an impending general election don't always get honoured. But I do think women are clearly very, very worried about the prospects of this country under a no-deal Brexit, and that will affect the NHS, it will affect food, it will affect families, it will affect all the issues that women really care about.
Thank you. Shobna Nassimi, you are part of the changing face of the Conservative Party. Boris Johnson is a bit of a liability for people like you, isn't he?
Well, actually, in comparison, he has stood for a diverse parliament to ensure that when we discuss policy agendas, it shapes the people that the British people that we seek to govern. Organisations such as Women to Win, the Conservative Women's Organisation, and 50-50 Parliament campaign, in which I'm an ambassador of, prove the statement completely wrong, that the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson actively encourages women to stand and bring in a different perception so that we can ensure that women's rights are being addressed.
We're going to have to leave it there. Shobna Nassimi, Faiza Shaheen, and Baroness Patient Rees-Croft, thank you so much for joining us. Chris.
Well, that was an interesting video. I think, right.
Minister of Housing, Larry. Trip Director Mark Nicholson then presented a feline, a gift from the United States.
Larry, I'm the American government. I want to present you with this replicable rat. Oh!
You like the mouse, look at that.
Let's see if we can tempt him out. Here we have the milk. Right, let's put this here. See if we can persuade Larry to come and give an exclusive interview to Sky News.
It gives me the opportunity to put a rumour to rest as well, even more serious than the Strictly Come Dancing one. And he'll appreciate this because El Gato, his cat, is particularly famous. And the rumour that somehow I don't love Larry, I do.
So this is David Cameron with Jeremy Corbyn talks.
He belongs to the house and the staff love him very much, as do I.
Larry the cat wants to go inside number 10, so the policeman should let him in. Down the street. Theresa, mate.
What the hell are you doing? Pick the cat up. Nasty. You're bad. Can you let this way, sir? Oh, you're scared him off.
Well, what could one say? Thinking.
The sound of a mother's love echoing through the Malaysian jungle. The hope is that Maeve Quarren's daughter will hear her calls and, if she can, walk towards them. This elite commando force has now joined a team of over 250 people on a sixth day of searching for 15-year-old Nora, who has learning and developmental disabilities. Working in shifts, they're using drones, helicopters and sniffer dogs, as well as handing out flyers to local residents with Nora's photograph on them. Police say she may have climbed out of this window in her family's holiday home, found open after her disappearance.
It's not locked from inside. Of course, can be possible.
But her family say she'd never leave them voluntarily.
Nora likes to walk with her family, but her balance is limited and she struggles with coordination. She has been to Asia before and she's been to many European countries, and she's never wandered off or got lost. Nora is very sensitive outside the family. Nora's very shy and can be quite anxious, and every night she has special time for cuddles and a nighttime story with her mum. And she was just extremely excited about spending time with her family on a holiday in Malaysia.
The authorities are once again searching the resort where Nora disappeared, set in an orchard right next to the vast expanse of jungle.
We are now focusing in getting any information which can we go back to the place and pinpoint the exact spot, any of the exact spot around, including the building, the chalet, around to recheck again.
As they step up their team's search, authorities fear that Nora wouldn't easily negotiate the dense woods of this nature reserve alone. But alongside her family and all the locals here, they're praying for a miracle. News Addicts by News.
Well, just trying to think what else I can show in the video. See here.
When he signed up his cabinet, they were told they had to sign up to no deal. But today, even this hardline Brexit team appears to have dissenters within its ranks. The Transport Minister, George Freeman, a late convert to supporting Mr Johnson's leadership, warned that threatening no deal was legitimate, but going ahead with it, a different matter.
I do not agree with those very few hardliners who think that a WTO long term would be satisfactory. I don't at all. I think it would be an absolute disaster, and politically for my party would see us out of office for 2 decades, I think.
He went on to suggest an election now wasn't a good idea.
It's a huge gamble. It may be that the last 3 years have overstretched the elastic, and the Conservative Party will lose many of its professional public service, commuter, sort of moderate centrists will go to the Lib Dems.
In a sign that any dissent won't be tolerated by the new government, Mr Freeman was later forced to issue a clarification, saying, "I firmly support the Prime Minister and his approach. What also won't be tolerated, apparently, is holidays. Special advisers to ministers being told that if they've booked any leave, they'll have to cancel." Labour fears it's all about preparing for an election and has written to the Cabinet Secretary Mark Sedwill, seen here welcoming Boris Johnson to number 10, demanding he intervene if the government allows no deal to happen regardless.
It would be totally and utterly unconstitutional. It would be an unprecedented move and entirely anti-democratic for one government to bind another once a general election is called.
So is an election on the cards? Michael Gove was asked on a visit to Northern Ireland.
I don't want a general election because I believe it's important that we get on with delivering Brexit and also ensure that the other opportunities that the Prime Minister has made clear that he wants the United Kingdom to enjoy can be provided.
But all the signs are that the government is getting ready for an election, even if some are sceptical about the Brexit policy on which they'd fight one. Libby Vina, News at 10, Westminster.
I don't want a general election either. We've already done that ages ago. Leave with a deal, EU. 37th of October this year, 2019. Right.
It may be the quietest, prettiest of villages, but forevermore Maids Morton will be known for a murderous plot to defraud two of its residents, who each fell under the spell of this church warden, Ben Field.
Here is a cold, calculating, devious man who took pleasure from inflicting both physical and mental torment on his victim. Yeah, evil.
Peter Farker thought Ben Field was warm and loving. They got engaged, but to Field it was all a greedy, sadistic project.
I'm actually used to be sort of competent. Of course. Of course.
Over several months, Field turned this university lecturer into a confused wreck, drugging his food. He'd fall over and, convinced he'd lost his mind, changed his will, leaving his house to Field, who then suffocated him there. But having manipulated and murdered one victim, Field just wanted
This is
more.
horrible news, this, guys, I tell you.
Just 3 doors down.
What they're talking about on the news now.
His elderly neighbour. He started a relationship with 83-year-old Anne Moore Martin. This time he left messages on mirrors, convincing her they were God, instructing her to give him money. He even called her pension provider.
Just going to hand you over to hello. I'm thinking of withdrawing.
I think this guy's sick, this guy here. That's on the news now. Doing that.
Niece alerted the police, and though she died from natural causes, her family say she'd been tormented at the end of her life.
She's just a lovely lady. Really nice lady. It's beggars belief that she's no longer around.
Andrew used to help Anne with her gardening and is horrified by what happened to her.
You just don't believe anybody could be like that. Especially in a little community like this. It's not heard of. It's worrying and it's frightening and it's really upsetting.
Anne's family say she was a gentle, beautiful soul, while Peter's say he was robbed of all that was precious to him. Both were intelligent and independent, but police say it shows people can still be vulnerable, even in a village as idyllic as this. Ben Chapman, News at 10, Buckinghamshire.
Well, that's horrible news in Buckinghamshire, as you guys may know. If you've ever heard of that, I think that's horrible and terrible what's gone on there. It annoys you when people do silly things like that.
They're going inside a chicken processing plant in Mississippi. Immigration officers here and at 6 other sites. Inside, they detained not dozens, but hundreds of alleged undocumented workers. But the largest ever such raids have broken much more than just records.
Yep.
I love you, Mom, and I hope you stay safe.
The scandal was not the scale of the operation, but what happened next, expressed through the tears of 11-year-old Magdalena, alone without her parents.
He's not a criminal or something. That's what the immigrants took them. Please let him free.
And there are many more children like her. Some were cared for by strangers after coming home to find no parents, prompting criticism from Democrats and a robust defense from the president.
I want people to know that if they come into the United States illegally, they're getting out. They're going to be brought out. And this serves as a very good deterrent. If people come into our country illegally, they're going out.
Most of those arrested were Hispanic, and the perceived backdrop to this operation is what
I can understand why they're sneaking over from America to Mexico, because they don't want the trouble in Mexico. Because of all the murders in Mexico, they want to have a peaceful life in America. I don't understand why they're sneaking over.
Since his campaign and throughout his administration, and the message is you are not welcome, especially if you didn't come into the country illegally, and especially if you're from Mexico or Central America. And he's been very specific.
Immigration officials say the operation was racially neutral, but it appears to have compounded the sense among some Hispanic communities that they're being terrorized, and from many different sources. Rohit Katru, News at 10, Washington.
Bloody world we live in. Typical. Every time. I think I might just leave it here in this video, guys. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Like I say all the time, please like, comment, subscribe, share these videos with your friends. It does help. Thank you for joining me, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace, guys. Next one, peace.